Hi, good evening, everyone. It is 6 o'clock, so we will get going for the evening. Welcome to our sixth session together. So we're very near the end of our time as a course. So we have tonight, which we're going to talk about motivation, finish up our discussion from last week on motivation. Then on Thursday, we'll be back together again in person on campus, and we'll talk about leadership and the impact of leadership on organizational effectiveness. And we'll see how much time we have left then, our Thursday session. And if we have time remaining, then on Thursday, we'll also then kind of do a wrap up of our content for the course. I have a little bit to talk to you about at the end of our session on Thursday, if we have time, about some of the common characteristics of effective organizations. And I'll take you through some of the existing research on organizational effectiveness, and we'll kind of look for some of those commonalities that we tend to see in what organizations we consider to be effective. So that's what we're looking at right now. Again, we'll see how we proceed tonight, but right now tonight, all I really have envisioned for us is just to wrap up our discussion that we started last week on motivational theories, do a group exercise, and then we'll see where we are standing time-wise when we're finished with that. So reminders before we get started with our information tonight. On Thursday, you have your alternative solutions paper that is due by midnight. We talked a little bit about that again last week. So we'll be presenting 3 different alternative solutions to that issue or that problem that you had identified. And then for each one of those solutions, you'll tell me a little bit about the solution. You'll tell me what the solution is all about, who's involved in the solution. You'll give me an idea of in terms of that solution, how easy or how difficult it could be to implement that solution. And you'll do that then for each of those 3 alternative solutions. I'm also asking if you can just give me a little paragraph at the beginning of the alternative solutions paper, just to remind me about your issue or the problem that you are focusing upon. So you've got that due then on Thursday by midnight. The next Monday, you have discussion board number 5 due, and discussion board number 5 will draw upon the information that we talked about with our models of organizational effectiveness, and you'll be identifying the model or models plural that you see most frequently used in your organization, and that will be discussion board 5. Then next Thursday on the 15th, you then have your chosen solution paper due by midnight, and you will then also have discussion board number 6, which is just distilling some of that information in your chosen solution paper into a couple of paragraphs to share with everyone else in the class in the discussion forum. Now, I do realize that since we have things kind of backloaded this term, so we have the alternative solutions paper due this coming Thursday, and then a week later, the chosen solution paper. What I will do is I will turn your alternative solutions paper around very, very quickly. So you turn it on Thursday. I should be able to get it back to you by midday on Friday with any comments or any recommendations. So you'll have that information then for your chosen solution paper. Choose either 1 or 2 or 3 of those solutions and tell me why that solution or those solutions are the most appropriate solutions to use to address the problem. So those are the 4 assignments that you still have left for our semester together. So please be mindful of those dates. And I think that's it for all the housekeeping issues. One thing I will do, though, is I'm going to turn my camera off. I'm not being rude or anything, but just to try and save on bandwidth a little bit, make sure that we can stay connected for the whole 2 hours tonight. I'll just turn that off, but I'll be talking so you'll know that I'm actually here and engaged. Okay. Are there any questions before we get back into our discussion of motivational theories? Okay.
Nope.
Yeah, go ahead. Any questions? Oh, we good? Okay. All right, then let's pick up kind of where we left off on Thursday and just kind of back up a little bit and just cover some of these content-based theories again before we then move into our process-oriented theories. And in our discussion of these motivational theories, the primary idea behind this entire argument is to find that linkage between how to motivate employees and then what that then means for the effectiveness of our organizations. And we similarly look back over the past few decades at the motivation literature. We can divide our motivational theories up into 2 broad categories: content-based theories and process-based theories. And we identified these content-based theories of motivation as being concerned with the particular needs, motives, and rewards that will affect an individual employee's motivation. So it's kind of the content, the substance of what actually motivates an individual employee. Then we said there's a second category of these theories, the process-based theories. And these process-based theories focus more on the psychological and the behavioral processes that underlie motivation. So we're kind of looking more at the processes we use in order to motivate our employees, as opposed to necessarily what types of elements and what types of factors actually motivate those employees, as we would when we were looking at content-based theories. So we presented last week are 4 different examples of content-based theories: Maslow, McGregor, Herzberg, and McClellan. Maslow, we presented as this hierarchy of needs that everyone's familiar with. And we said that people are motivated by having a deficiency in those deficiency needs, or they can also then be motivated by the desire to grow, the desire to self-actualize, the desire to achieve their utmost potential, the desire to be all that they can be. So Maslow's contribution to our understanding of the content of motivation is that we need to know our individual employees, and we need to know if they are suffering from deficiency needs or if they are aspiring to growth through self-actualization, that growth need. So different employees will then be motivated differently. We said Douglas McGregor, who was a big believer in Abraham Maslow, used it to then develop his very famous theory X and theory Y dichotomy. We said theory X approach is the very traditional theory. We know the theory Y approach says that employees are really more motivated by trying to fulfill their higher order types of needs. And we'd already defined with McGregor the idea that most of our organizations are classical theory X organizations, but the majority of our employees are more modern theory Y employees. And so in order to motivate our employees, we have to transition our organizations from a classical theory X type of perspective into our more modern theory Y type of an approach. And that's how we best motivate our employees. So theory Y employees are going to be motivated by self-actualization, the growth motivators. Theory X employees will be more motivated by those deficiency needs. Herzberg then draws this nice distinction between these growth and these deficiency needs by kind of reterming them as motivators versus hygiene factors. And we said last week that Herzberg identifies these motivators as being your more intrinsic types of incentives, things such as someone's interest in work, someone's desire for achievement, those higher order needs. Those are the motivators. Those are the types of things that if you appeal to, those are the types of things that will motivate employees. So the content of motivation really tends to lie with those motivators, as opposed to the hygiene factors, which are your extrinsic incentives, things such as organizational conditions, rewards for performance. Those hygiene factors, according to Herzberg, can prevent job dissatisfaction, but they will not in and of themselves lead to motivation. In order to motivate employees, you need to rely more on those motivators, those more intrinsic types of incentives, like interest in work, desire for achievement, and those higher order types of needs. So what Herzberg does is he kind of adds a little bit more nuance onto the Maslowian hierarchy of needs, as well as McGregor's dichotomy of theory X and theory Y. So he adds a little bit more nuance into the discussion. Then the fourth content-based theorist that we introduced was McClellan and McClellan's needs-based model. We said McClellan identifies 3 different types of motivational needs. There are achievement motivation, there's authority power motivation, and there's the need for affiliation motivation. What McClellan tells us is that most of our employees are going to be motivated by the desire for achievement. So achievement motivation carries the day with the majority of our employees, which tracks very well with McGregor, since McGregor says the majority of our employees are theory Y employees. You would assume that they would then be motivated by this desire for growth and achievement. Authority power motivation is much more in line with what our supervisors, what managers would want. And then affiliation motivation is much more in line with those individual employees who are not quite to that self-actualization level yet in terms of their emotional maturity and development. And so they're going to be more motivated by having this sense of belonging and knowing that they are respected, knowing that they fit within a team, they have a role to play in the team and the organization. They're going to be motivated by that affiliation type of motivation. But the vast majority of our employees, according to McClellan, are motivated by achievement. And he defined this achievement as this dynamic restlessness to try and achieve mastery over your environment through success at achieving your goals by using your own abilities, your own cunning, in your own effort. And kind of a master of your own environment is what he considered achievement to be. So again, this just underscores the idea that there's no one size fits all approach, that we need to understand our employees, to know who they are, to know where they're coming from, to know which of these motivators, achievement, authority, or affiliation, will motivate an individual employee. We then provided this comparison of Maslow to McGregor to Herzberg to McClellan with this chart. And as we said, with Maslow, the deficiency needs correlate very strongly with the theory X of McGregor, which correlates with the hygiene factors of Herzberg, which correlates with the power and the affiliation motivators of McClellan. The higher order growth needs like self-actualization correlate with McGregor's theory Y, with Herzberg's motivators, and with McClellan's achievement motivation. So it's kind of give you this basis for comparing those four different content-based theorists. Then we also said that regardless of which of those content-based theories you ascribe to, it is important that employees feel that they are being treated in a fair and equitable manner. And so we introduced this idea of Adams equity theory. And Adams equity theory just simply says that employees put forth certain inputs into their job, like effort and time and ability and commitment and honesty and collegiality and integrity. And they then expect outputs such as their paycheck, benefits, vacation time, so on and so on. Whenever employees feel that there is imbalance between the inputs and the outputs, and that they're getting less outputs and putting in more inputs, that's when you end up violating the Adams equity theory, and that's when you're going to have people being less motivated to put forth effort on a consistent basis. And that's how we defined motivation last week, is the willingness to put forth this effort and to put forth this effort on a consistent, ongoing basis. We also identified that not only do people have to feel that they are being treated equitably by the organization, but they also need to feel that they are working in a just organization, that there is a sense of justice within the organization. And we said that there are two basic categories of organizational justice. There's distributive justice and there's procedural justice. Distributive justice really focuses on the fairness and equity in the distribution of the rewards and resources. So who gets what? And is that fair? So am I getting what I deserve? Is the employee next to me getting what they deserve? Procedural justice looks more at the processes used by the organization, the decision-making used by the organization, in then doling out those types of rewards and those types of incentives. So you need to have both distributive justice as well as procedural justice. If employees feel there's both distributive as well as procedural justice, then obviously that's going to correlate with more positive work-related attitudes. More positive work-related attitudes will then obviously lead to a more motivated workforce. So that kind of takes us up to where we left off at the end of our class last Thursday. And so we left off before we start talking about the second category of motivational theories, our process-based theories. And here we have four theories that we cover under process-based theories as well. We have Vroom's expectancy theory, we have Skinner's operant conditioning, we have Bandura's social learning or cognitive theory, and Edmonds Locke's goal-setting theory. So our first process-based theory is one that I'm sure that you have been introduced to before during your time here in the MPA program, and that is Victor Vroom's expectancy theory. And Victor Vroom, with his expectancy theory, makes the argument that an individual employee whenever they consider how much effort to put into their job, they will think about all the outcomes that could occur from this level of effort. They would think about how much they value all those outcomes, the probability that those outcomes are going to occur, and then all of those considerations will then contribute to an explanation of the amount of effort they're willing to exert in their jobs. Expectancy theory is predicated upon this classic utilitarian theory that people are rational, self-interested actors, and as such, they want to maximize their benefits while minimizing their costs. They want to maximize their pleasure while minimizing their pain. And that's this rational, utilitarian type of approach to understanding human behavior. And expectancy theory is all predicated on that type of utilitarian approach. So Vroom, with his expectancy theory, tells us that there are three main concepts that underpin expectancy theory: valence, expectancies, and instrumentality. Valence refers to the emotional orientation that people have with respect to outcomes or rewards. So how important, for example, is pay for performance? How important is additional flexibility? How important is to an employee to be challenged in their job? So what type of weight does an employee place upon all these potential outcomes, all these potential rewards that they could receive if they put forth a certain amount of effort? The second concept is expectancy. Expectancy speaks to the confidence the employee has in their abilities. So does an employee feel that, yes, if they put forth this amount of effort, this amount of effort will lead to a certain level of performance or productivity? What is the likelihood that if I put forth this effort, I will then achieve this level of performance? Am I 70% sure? Am I 90% sure? How confident am I in my own abilities? And then the third concept is instrumentality, which refers to the perception on the part of employees as to whether or not these rewards will actually materialize. So if I do achieve this level of productivity, what's the likelihood that management will actually come through with all these promised rewards and all these promised incentives if I achieve that level of productivity? So valence, expectancy, and instrumentality are the three main concepts underpinning expectancy theory. So the basic formula of expectancy theory that you see on the screen is that someone's amount of effort that they are going to devote to a task is a function of, and so the first item, the first term you have in your formula is the F function of, is a function of E to P. E stands for level of effort. P stands for performance. So what is the probability that if they put forth this level of effort, that they will achieve the level of performance that they want to achieve? So if they come in on the weekend to get this project done, what is the likelihood that putting forth that effort coming in on the weekend will lead to getting this project done by Monday morning? Again, are they 50% sure, 70% sure? How confident are they in their abilities? Multiply times your next function is P to O. The likelihood, the probability that if you achieve this level of performance, you will receive some type of a desired outcome. So if this project is completed by Monday morning, what is the likelihood then that completing this project by Monday morning will then lead to a certain type of reward? So what's the likelihood if the project is done by Monday morning that that employee will be rewarded, I don't know, with employee of the week or whatever the case may be? And then your final term, the V, multiplied times V, that stands for your valence level. How much weight and how important is it to someone to be employee of the week? How important is that outcome to that individual employee? So effort is a function of someone's confidence, their expectancy that a level of effort will lead to a level of performance, multiplied times the probability that that level of performance will lead to a desired outcome. That is going to be your instrumentality, multiplied times your valence level. How much weight do they place upon that outcome that they are going to receive? Now, the important thing here with Vroom's expectancy theory is even though he provides us with this formula, it's unrealistic to think that employees sit down there with their calculator on their phone and calculate out all these probabilities. They don't do that, but what they do in a more subjective, intuitive type of fashion is they will consider expectancies, instrumentalities, and valence levels in determining how much effort they are going to exert on a given basis in a given type of task. So for us, Vroom's expectancy theory, the importance, the implications of that for us is that in terms of valence levels, it means that managers must understand what individual employees value, how much they value certain extrinsic types of incentives and rewards versus intrinsic rewards. So we have to understand because every employee is going to have a different valence level that they apply to different types of rewards and outcomes. Second implication for managers is expectancies. We have to understand the confidence on the part of our employees that yes, if they put forth this effort, that yes, they come in and work on the weekend, that they are confident that that will result in them being able to get the project done by Monday morning. And then we also have to understand instrumentality, that if managers promise an outcome, managers must come through on those promises. They must deliver on what they have promised to their employees. So it's important for managers to understand valence, expectancy, and instrumentality and understand every employee is going to value things differently. Every employee is going to have a different confidence level. Every employee is going to have a different expectation in terms of how likely it is that they're actually going to receive this outcome or this reward if they achieve a certain level of performance. The nice thing about expectancy theory and how it has been applied in the research is it's been applied kind of similar to how we apply most explanatory types of models. And you know from your research classes, you understand explanatory models, causal types of relationships. And you know one of the ways in which we oftentimes answer our causal research questions is through regression analysis. And so in a kind of typical multiple regression analysis, you would be looking at that level of effort and you're trying to explain change or differences, variations in that level of effort based upon confidence, the expectancies, based upon instrumentality, the belief that you're going to receive these outcomes, and based upon the value that people place upon those outcomes. But again, I do think it's done in a much more subjective, kind of back of the envelope type of approach, as opposed to actually calculating through any type of expectancy formula. But it's interesting for us in our discussion of motivation because it kind of gives us some insight into the process of how we can motivate our employees and how managers need to understand valences, expectancies, and instrumentalities because they will differ depending upon which employee you are attempting to motivate. I tend to be a big fan of expectancy theory because it's kind of this nice linear approach. It's a very rational approach, and it kind of makes sense from a social science research type of a perspective. But again, it's something that's done in a much more subjective as opposed to a more objective type of fashion. Then a second process-based theory that we'll reach into psychology for is B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning. And if you were a psychology undergrad or you took any psychology courses, I'm sure you've talked a lot about B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning basically makes the argument that animals and then by extension human beings will develop behaviors in response to external stimuli. And so when people are presented with consequences of their action, those consequences can then be used to shape their behavior. People will repeat behavior that results in positive consequences. They will hopefully extinguish behavior that results in negative consequences. So it's a very simple type of theory on the impact of an external stimulus on the behavior of individual employees. In operant conditioning, we have found that obviously positive reinforcement, positive consequences tend to be much more efficient and effective at influencing behavior than at negative reinforcement. And so we typically in our organizations focus more on those positive types of reinforcement strategies. We have also found in the literature that a more intermittent reinforcement schedule, whereby positive reinforcement is provided at highly variable intervals, that it's those intermittent reinforcement types of schedules that tend to provide bigger advantages and provide um, a bigger result, if you will, in terms of shaping employee behavior and motivating those employees. Usually, when we provide this positive reinforcement in a highly variable type of a schedule, what we'll end up doing is it'll become longer in terms of the person acquiring the behavior, but the extinction of that behavior will end up being more slow in that it will stick with that person longer. And whenever people can predict when this positive reinforcement is going to hit, the less effective that positive reinforcement tends to be. So positive reinforcement tends to be provided on a more intermittent type of interval schedule in order to kind of cement and kind of freeze that behavior that we want to freeze in our employees. But it is a very basic type of theory that you provide these positive reinforcements, and that's how you can then shape behavior. That's how you can then get people to exhibit the behavior you want them to exhibit for them to be more productive and to achieve higher performance levels. Building upon this idea of operant conditioning and Skinner's theories, we have Albert Bandura's social learning cognitive theory. And in social learning cognitive theory, what Bandura does is Bandura looks more at the internal thought process of employees. And I think Ashley has a really good point in text chat that this is kind of what schools do with students to change bad behavior using PBIS, positive behavior and intervention supports, as opposed to negative consequences. And you're exactly right. You know, when I was in my district on the board, we had schools that became certified in PBIS. And those PBIS certified schools, everything was based upon positive reinforcement. You didn't have the negative consequences that you might have in a more traditional type of environment. And that's a great example of operant conditioning and using this positive type of reinforcement. So this positive type of reinforcement can certainly alter and can certainly modify behavior, but Bandura is really more interested in the impact it has on the thought process of the individual employee. So it looks at how people modify their behavior by looking at their internal cognitive processes, how they think about what they're trying to achieve, how they establish goals in their mind, how they then come up with ways and strategies to achieve their goals. So it doesn't look as much at the external consequences like Skinner did. This looks more at the internal cognitive processes of employees. So in social learning cognitive theory, the primary claim is that people learn in many ways other than just through extra outside reinforcement. That people can learn and they can develop positive behaviors by modeling the behavior of others. You know, we hear all the time how public leaders have a very, what we call expository role. And by expository role, we mean that public leaders role model. They role model behaviors not only for citizens, they role model behaviors for their employees as well. So employees will model their behavior after the behavior of others. Employees will also model their behavior through vicarious experiences. So someone doesn't have to actually experience something in order to change their behavior because of it. They can look at someone else experiencing something and they can live vicariously through that person's experience, and that can then model and shape their behavior. They shape their behavior through mental rehearsal and imagery. And so whenever you do a presentation in one of your courses in the MPA program, I know a lot of courses have a presentation requirement. I know in my program, we have at least half of our core courses have a presentation requirement so that we can be in alignment with NASPA's competency, their universal competency of the ability to interact with, I'm going to get it right, interact and communicate with a diverse workforce and citizenry in culturally responsive ways. And so we do a lot of these types of presentations in MPA courses. Before a presentation, you probably engage in a lot of mental rehearsal and imagery about the types of behaviors that will lead to a positive type of presentation. People with their internal cognitive processes also engage in a lot of self-management. They establish goals for themselves. They monitor their progress toward the achievement of their goals. And so in social learning theory, we're really looking at how people learn through vicarious experiences, how they learn by role modeling, how they learn through rehearsing things that they're going to do and rehearse behaviors that they want to exhibit in the future. And it's really more internal to the way in which people think in terms of how they will then mold and shape their behavior. Then our fourth process-oriented theory comes from Edwin Locke, and that's his goal-setting theory. Goal-setting theory essentially says that we can motivate people through the establishment of goals and then holding people accountable to the achievement of those goals. So kind of going back a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the organizational goals, if we can establish goals and hopefully establish goals that are relatively difficult to accomplish, we're going to elicit higher motivational levels than if we just rely upon very easy to accomplish goals. Once we're able to establish these difficult goals, it then focuses the behavior and the motivation of individuals to achieve those goals. People then become committed to their goals, and they need to receive feedback from management in terms of what progress they are making toward the achievement of those goals. Usually, as the value of the goal increases, the employee's commitment to achieving that goal increases as well. Goal setting theory tells us that goals have a lot of advantages for motivation. They can direct the attention of an employee on what they're trying to achieve. They can intensify the effort of those employees, which obviously leads to higher motivational levels. They can intensify the persistence of employees. They will intensify the likelihood that someone is going to stick with a goal until that goal is achieved. And they can also spark creativity in problem solving, in that there are multiple ways of achieving a goal, kind of similar to the assignments that we do in this class. There are multiple ways in which you can resolve this problem that you identified in your background paper. And that's why in our alternative solutions paper, we ask for 3 alternative solutions. So we're kind of sparking that creativity in solving that problem. We know that difficult goals tend to enhance performance more than simple goals because they really do appeal to people's desire to achieve, as we were told by McClellan, really appeals to that achievement motivation. And it also makes it easier for us to measure performance, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago. You can't really measure individual employee performance unless you have well-articulated and clear goals. Obviously, goal setting is important to have management support. If we don't have management support for the creation of those goals, it's going to be difficult to then reap the benefits in performance evaluation. The paradox that we are facing here is that more difficult goals are less likely to be achieved. Since they're less likely to be achieved immediately, it leaves people unsatisfied because they have not achieved these goals. That then in turn fosters ambition and pushes people to exert more effort and to work harder to then achieve these more difficult goals. It kind of borrows from a theory from the world of physics known as field theory. And I'm really going to paraphrase it, but basically what field theory says in physics is that we all survive, we all exist within this field of forces. And these forces will exert force upon us, and that force that's being exerted upon us will then cause us to take certain actions and to respond in certain types of ways. Well, whenever you have a goal that has not been achieved, it creates this tension on the part of the individual, and the only way to relieve that tension is by achieving the goal. And so the primary motivation of that employee is to relieve that tension and to do so by working harder to achieve the goal. So again, it's a little paradoxical that difficult goals are hard to achieve, but it's those difficult goals that tend to motivate employees much more than a very simple, very easy to achieve goal. Goals that kind of mix qualitative and quantitative indicators also can be highly motivating because we now have multiple ways of measuring the achievement of that goal. And if we can't measure it quantitatively at this point in time, we can measure it a little bit more qualitatively. Think about, you've all probably, or most of you probably had the policy analysis course. And so you understand that when we are analyzing, we're evaluating policies, oftentimes we try to evaluate public policies before they are ready to be evaluated. You may have to give a policy a year or 2 years before you'll actually have quantitative indicators of the success of that policy. So while you are waiting for those quantitative indicators to be developed and to be measured, there may be some qualitative ways in which you can get a general anecdotal sense of how well that program or how well that policy is currently working. And then we also know it's important that we assign responsibility for the achievement of goals. People need to be held responsible for achieving goals. If no one is held responsible for the achievement of those goals, obviously those goals will probably never be achieved. Another recommendation for effective goal setting for motivation to empower employees to develop strategies for achieving these goals. So it's important that they kind of play a role in being able to come up with the strategies and the tactics that they need to employ to achieve the goals. The more that they are developed, the more they're involved in the development of strategies, obviously, the more likely they are to buy in to those strategies. That's an old maxim in public administration that comes from authors like Martha Durthick, who argue to us the more you involve your implementers in the implementation, the more likely they are to then support that implementation. Goal setting, as we said before, requires the support of management and effective leadership. And goal setting really does require a feedback mechanism. We have to have that feedback loop built into the achievement of our goals. People need to be committed to goals. As we have said before, managers need to stress the importance of those goals, why those goals have value, and that they are attainable. They may be difficult, but they are still attainable. And a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the problem of goal multiplicity. And so if you have too many goals, you end up with goal overload, and employees really don't know where to exert their effort and which goal to put their effort toward trying to achieve. So those are four what we call process-based motivational theories: expectancy theory, operant conditioning, social learning or cognitive theory, and then goal setting theory. But really looking at the process by which we can motivate employees within our organizations. So where are we at currently in terms of our understanding of motivation theory? One thing that has become very clear through our review of the literature is that there is no singular theory that has provided a conclusive explanation of motivation. Researchers will make the argument that motivation theory is really in kind of a disorderly state, in that there is no one magic bullet, there is no one universal theory, that there are separate theories that will apply in different types of settings. Again, going back to my favorite answer for everything, it depends. The motivational theory that would be most appropriate in a situation depends upon the context of that situation. So where the motivational theory, the motivation literature is really kind of focusing now is on the development of taxonomies to try and create a taxonomy of motivational types and the settings and the context in which those motivational types and theories would be most appropriate. So the motivational theory, which motivational theory would be most appropriate for this type of employee who is at this point in their Chris Argyros personal growth journey, that is at this point in their emotional maturity, that is in this type of a position, that is doing these types of functions in this type of an organization. So it's important that we start to put these together into these taxonomies to see what theories work best in which given situation. even though we have kind of abandoned the idea of looking for the magic bullet, the one size fits all universal theory, I think the literature is still very useful for us because it really does underscore to us how complex it is in motivating employees. And that complexity is especially true here in the public sector. Motivating employees in the public sector has always been said to be more difficult than doing so in the private sector. And one of the primary reasons for that, obviously, is that we have to rely more upon intrinsic as opposed to extrinsic incentives in motivating our employees. We have very highly structured and imposed civil service systems. We have very sophisticated and developed collective bargaining systems and collective bargaining agreements that we need to adhere to. When we talk about the public sector, kind of writ large, we kind of do ourselves a disservice in that we know that when we look at the public sector very myopically, we don't recognize all the differences between different types of public organizations. A few weeks ago, when we talked about different types of organizations, and we showed the gradations between a pure private organization and a pure public organization. We said the types of services and goods that are delivered by public organizations will differ, and that some are very much in line with pure public types of goods. Some goods they deliver are more collective pool and more toll goods in terms of their characteristics. So there are certainly differences there. We know that if we just look at the federal level, there are agencies, there are departments, there are commissions, there are regulatory agencies, there are independent agencies, there are government corporations, there are government-sponsored enterprises. So there are all these different types of governments. So not every government agency is the same. And in some agencies, there's more of an opportunity to utilize extrinsic incentives, such as pay for performance plans, as opposed to some other organizations. So if you're in a government corporation, there may be a little bit more flexibility for you in using pay for performance, as opposed to if you're in a traditional agency or a traditional type of a department. So we know we have some limitations in terms of how we can motivate our employees, especially motivating them through the use of these extrinsic types of incentives, these extrinsic types of motivators. Because we have these limitations in the public sector on the use of extrinsic incentives, the natural assumption that kind of grows out of that is that, well, if we can't use extrinsic incentives, then obviously public employees are going to be far less motivated than their private sector colleagues who do have access to all these extrinsic incentives. And that's the argument that has been typically made. The research, however, does not agree with that completely. And if you look at the research in terms of public sector motivation, what the research usually tells us is that, yes, there is a difference between motivational levels among private versus public employees. And yes, the motivational levels tend to be a little bit higher in the private sector as compared to the public sector. However, these differences have not been shown to be statistically significant differences. And you're, again, going back to research, you're familiar with what statistical significance means. We know that with statistical significance, if there's a difference that is statistically significant, it means that it's a large enough difference that we can say with great confidence, usually 95% confidence, that this difference did not occur just by random chance, just by dumb luck. Well, the differences in motivation are so small that they lack that type of statistical significance. And so we don't know if there really is this true significant difference in motivational levels between public and private employees. In fact, when we do these surveys, we find that public employees do tend to have relatively high levels of motivation and employee engagement. Last Thursday, we went through this federal study that's done every year, and I showed you all the different indices that were used in that study. And the whole purpose of the study was to see how engaged and how motivated federal employees are. And for the most part, they are relatively engaged and they are highly motivated. And so for most of those indicators and most of those indices, federal employees tend to score very high in terms of engagement and motivation. So despite all the constraints and all the frustrations that we run into in the public sector, public employees still tend to appear to be highly motivated, if not quite as highly motivated as their private sector counterparts. The differences are certainly not statistically significant. But let's focus in and drill down a little bit more on this idea of the relationship between incentives and motivation, because there is no doubt that the provision of these incentives will have a positive impact upon motivation. I mean, we know that from Victor Vroom. He told us that in terms of looking at our outcomes and the valence levels that are applied to those outcomes. So when we look at the incentives that can be used in order to enhance worker motivation, Chester Barnard, who we run into all the time in public administration, he writes in terms of systems theory, he writes in terms of human relations theory. He also chimes in here in terms of motivation. And Chester Barnard basically breaks up incentives into two binary categories: worker-specific incentives and non-worker-specific incentives. Worker-specific incentives are things such as material incentives, pay, those types of things. Non-material incentives, things such as recognition, work conditions specific to that employee, that employee has work conditions that appeal to that specific employee. Those are worker-specific types of incentives. Then the second category are your non-specific types of incentives, things such as a freedom from hostility and the provision of comfortable practices, customary practices, practices within the organization that all employees are comfortable with, and that all employees feel that they are safe from hostility when they come to work. Those are non-worker specific because those are going to apply to everyone, hopefully, in the entire organization. Herb Simon, who we also run into a great deal in the public administration literature, also chimes in here in terms of incentives and motivation. And he makes his dichotomy along the lines of employee versus employer incentives. So he says the types of incentives that appeal to employees are money, prestige, social opportunities, promotional opportunities, as contrasted to the types of incentives that appeal to the employers, which is more power and authority. And again, this goes back to our good friend McClellan. And so we tend to see different types of incentives that can be used for employees as opposed to the incentives that usually appeal more to the employers. Then we have our good friend Anthony Downs, who also chimes in here and provides us with a little bit additional context in terms of understanding how we motivate individual employees in terms of providing them with incentives that they place a value upon. And we talked a little bit about Tony Downs last week, and I know I got some nods from people that you have dealt with Anthony Downs before in the program. But as we had mentioned last week, Downs presents us with what he calls his bureau ideologies. And he argues to us that there are different types of employees in our organizations. He identifies 5 different bureau ideologies: climbers, conservers, zealots, advocates, and statesmen. Climbers, according to Downs, are your younger employees, the ones who are newer, more recent to the organization. Those employees tend to be motivated by incentives such as promotional opportunities. So if you provide them with those opportunities to move up in the organization, to progress up the organizational ladder, those are the types of incentives that tend to motivate those types of younger employees, those climbers. If, however, the organization does not provide the requisite promotional opportunities to those climbers will then engage in a process known as jumping. Jumping is when they just simply leave the organization and go to another organization that they feel will provide them with those promotional opportunities. Second type of bureau ideology, or second type of employee, is a conserver. According to Downs, these conservers are those employees who are more veteran employees. I won't say older, I'll say the more veteran employees employees who have been in the organization for a while, employees who have already developed all the perquisites of the office. They've already developed all these great perks of the office that they want to just try and maintain. So they are motivated by trying to conserve all those perks of the office that they have already developed. So you would motivate those individuals by allowing them the opportunity to keep what they already have and not threatening what they already have been able to accumulate. Then Downs tells us the third type of employee or ideology is a zealot. Zealots are those employees who are very much hardcore believers in a certain type of issue or a certain type of policy. So they are going to be motivated by appealing to that issue or that policy. So if they're a zealot, they're a real big believer in this issue, then if you can appeal to that issue and you can show them how, if they put forth the effort, it will help us solve this problem or address this issue or promote this policy, that's how you are then going to motivate those zealots. Your fourth type of ideology is an advocate. An advocate is someone who is more supportive generally of their department or their division or their unit. And so they are going to advocate for their department. I think I've said, like a department chair at the academic world is a good example of an advocate, that they advocate for their departments in terms of getting more faculty and getting more line items in the budget, being able to offer more courses. Those are all the things that they tend to advocate for. And then your final category are your statesmen or statespeople. And in this category, you have employees who are really interested in doing the public good. These are the people, the employees who are very much motivated by the public interest. They are very motivated by trying to help the collective good, to try help society. And those that he referred to as your statesmen. Well, going back to my favorite question that I told you about in our first night of class or second night of class, my so what question. Well, so what? The clear so what here is that what Downs is telling us is, again, we need to understand our employees and treat our employees differently when it comes to motivating those employees. Each employee is going to be motivated by a different type of incentive based upon the type of employee that we are dealing with. So to kind of wrap up this discussion of incentives and motivation, if you're really interested in the literature on the relationship between incentives and the motivation of public employees, a really good person to read is James L. Perry. And Perry devoted a lot of his career to trying to answer this question of what motivates public employees. Are public employees motivated more by intrinsic as opposed to extrinsic motivators? And what types of intrinsic motivators truly motivate public employees? So what Perry does is he creates these questionnaire items because, as we know from our discussion last week, if you want to measure motivational levels of employees, you have to go directly to those employees themselves, and you have to extract that information directly from those employees. And so the primary collection tool we tend to use in the social sciences, the use of surveys, questionnaires. So for Perry, the way in which he tried to extract this information is through his questionnaire items. He tried to measure 4 different dimensions of motivation on the part of public employees. The first dimension, attraction to public affairs. The second dimension, commitment to the public interest. Third dimension, compassion. And the fourth dimension, self-sacrifice. So when he tried to measure public employees' attraction to public affairs, he would use indicators such as statements like politics is a dirty word. And then here you would have your normal Likert scale, strongly agree, agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, and then strongly disagree. This is obviously a reverse one because if someone strongly agrees that politics is a dirty word, it may mean that they're not that attracted to public affairs because, as we know, there truly is no real dichotomy between politics and administration. As John Gauss told us back in 1936, politics will bleed over into administration. There is really never that true type of dichotomy between the two worlds. Another statement he uses on his questionnaires: the give and take of public policy making doesn't appeal to me. Again, obviously, this is a reversed one. And I don't care much for politicians. Again, a reversed one in terms of attraction to public affairs. The indicators he tends to use on his surveys for commitment to public interest: it is hard to get me generally interested in what's going on in my community. Obviously, another reversed indicator. I unselfishly contribute to my community. Meaningful public service is very important to me. I would prefer seeing public officials do what is best for the community, even if it harmed my own personal self-interest. I consider public service as a civic duty, and those are all then indicators of how committed they are to public interest. In terms of compassion, I am rarely moved by the plight of the underprivileged, obviously a reverse one. Most social programs are too vital to do without. It is difficult for me to contain my feelings when I see people in distress. To me, patriotism includes seeing to the welfare of others. I seldom think about the welfare of people whom I don't know personally, another reversed one. I am often reminded by daily events about how dependent we are on one another. I have little compassion for people in need who are unwilling to take the first step to help themselves. And then there are few public programs I wholeheartedly support, another reversed indicator. And then finally, the fourth dimension of self-sacrifice: making a difference in society means more to me than personal achievements. I believe in putting duty before self. Doing well financially is definitely more important to me than doing good deeds, a reversed one. Much of what I do is for a cause bigger than myself. Serving citizens would give me a good feeling even if no one paid me for it. I feel people should give back to society more than they get from it. I am one of those rare people who would risk personal loss to help someone else. And then finally, I am prepared to make enormous sacrifices for the good of society. So essentially what Perry is obviously getting at with these very simple questionnaire items is how committed people are to self-sacrifice, how compassionate they are, how committed they are to public interest, and how attracted are they to public affairs and to public service. The basic moral of the story with all of Perry's writings is that he has found that, for the most part, yes, there is a very strong public service motivation among public sector employees. And yes, public sector employees are more motivated by intrinsic motivators and intrinsic incentives as compared to their private sector counterparts. And just on an anecdotal basis, I can tell you, reviewing a lot of applications to an MPA program every single year, I see that come through very strongly in those essays, those statements of intent. And everyone talks about their commitment to public interest in the public sector, and then they talk about why they have this commitment. Sometimes it's because of some formative experiences they've had when they were children. Sometimes it's because of their family, that their parents are very involved in public service or very involved in politics, and that kind of led them into it. Sometimes there is some type of a traumatic event that they've experienced, perhaps that they have lacked accommodations. They have been homeless at some point in their lives, or have lacked adequate food, been hungry, and so those types of formative experiences have then led them to more of a commitment in public interest. I think that's something we certainly do see among our public employees, and so our focus is usually much more on those intrinsic as compared to those intrinsic incentives. So between what we covered in the second half of class on Thursday and what we have covered here in the first half of class tonight, that kind of completes our discussion of motivation theory and the linkage between motivating employees and the effectiveness of organizations. And clearly there is a very direct positive correlation between motivated employees and organizational effectiveness. And on Thursday, when we kind of wrap up the entire show and we talk about some of the commonalities between effective organizations, we'll return to that point, because that clearly is one of the most important commonalities among all organizations that we would consider to be effective organizations, however we measure effectiveness. And one of the many things I hope you'll take with you from this class when we are done next week is that there is no one way of measuring effectiveness. And we've all these different models and all these different indicators of what an organization can consider to be effective. So are there any questions on these motivational theories, content versus process theories, anything on any of that information? Okay. Seeing none, then let's just go ahead and take a real quick break. Let's take about a 10-minute break and let's come back at 7:10. And when we come back at 7:10, we will turn our attention to our normal thing we do in the second half of class, which is our group exercise. And we'll break up into 3 groups. I'll break you up into 3 groups since we are on Zoom. And I'll have each group identify the motivational approaches that you tend to see in your organizations and what types of similarities you see between your organizations in the motivational approaches that are used. So take a break till 7:10. We'll come back and do our group work.
Okay.